Take a second and think about this. Right now, millions of Americans automatically put part of every paycheck into a 401k. It's become such a normal part of working life that most people never stop to ask where it came from. We just assume it's always been there, like it's one of those things America has always had. But that's not true. The 401k didn't even exist until 1978, and people didn't really start using it until the early 1980s. That means your grandparents, and for many people, even your parents, spent most of their working lives in a completely different world. So here's the question. If there was no 401k, no company match, no retirement account, no Social Security in the early years, and for many workers, not even a pension, how did ordinary Americans survive when they got too old to work? Did they save enough money on their own? Did their employers take care of them? Or did they simply have nowhere to turn? The answer is far more unsettling than most people realize. For most of American history, retirement wasn't something people looked forward to. It wasn't a reward after decades of hard work. It wasn't even something most families expected. If your body gave out before your savings did, you were lucky. If it didn't, old age could become one of the hardest chapters of your life. What's even more surprising is that the retirement system millions of Americans depend on today wasn't created through one carefully designed master plan. It grew out of economic crises, political compromises, corporate decisions, unexpected loopholes, and a series of events that almost nobody saw coming. And every major change promised to make life more secure. Some did. Some solved one problem while creating another. And some quietly shifted the biggest financial risk from companies to ordinary workers without most people ever noticing. Once you see how this system was actually built, you'll never look at retirement the same way again. More importantly, you'll understand why so many Americans still worry about growing old, even after spending an entire lifetime working. Because this isn't just the history of the 401k. It's the story of how America tried to solve one of life's oldest problems and why that challenge still isn't completely solved today. This hook is designed to create curiosity, build emotional connection, and naturally lead into part one without giving away too much too early. It's easy to think retirement has always been part of life. Work for a few decades, save some money, retire, and enjoy your later years. But for most of history, that idea simply didn't exist. People didn't plan for retirement because they never expected to retire in the first place. You worked for as long as your body would let you. When you couldn't work anymore, life usually became a struggle. There wasn't a backup plan waiting for you. One big reason was life expectancy. Around 1,900, the average person in the world lived only about 31 years. In the United States, it was a little higher, around 47. Those numbers weren't just statistics. They completely changed how people thought about the future. Most Americans never reached an age where retirement was even a real question. Many died from disease, dangerous working conditions, or simple medical problems that are easy to treat today. Growing old wasn't something everyone could count on, and if you were one of the people who did live into old age, that didn't mean life suddenly got easier. You kept working. Farmers stayed in the fields, blacksmiths stayed at the forge, shop owners stayed behind the counter. Factory workers kept showing up as long as they could stand on their feet. There wasn't a moment when someone handed you a gold watch, thanked you for your years of service, and sent you home with a monthly check. That world didn't exist. Retirement wasn't considered a stage of life. It was more like a privilege that only a tiny number of wealthy families could afford. If you had enough land, enough savings, or enough wealth to stop working, you were the exception, not the rule. For everyone else, work and survival were almost the same thing. The moment you stopped earning money, life became uncertain. That reality shaped the way Americans thought for generations. People didn't ask, "When should I retire?" They asked a much harder question, "How long can I keep working?" And that one question affected everything. It influenced how families were built, why people had large households, and why children were often seen as more than just family. They were also the people who would someday help support aging parents. For centuries, that was the closest thing America had to a retirement system. It wasn't built by the government, it wasn't offered by employers, it wasn't managed by Wall Street. It was built on family, hard work, and the hope that when your strength finally faded, someone would still be there to help you. For a long time, that system was enough. But America was about to change in ways no one could have imagined. And when it did, the old way of growing old began to fall apart. For generations, that family system worked. Parents raised their children, the children grew up, stayed close to home, and eventually took over the farm or the family business. When their parents became too old to work, they didn't move away. They simply stepped in. It wasn't perfect. Life was hard. Money was always tight. But most older Americans weren't alone because their families were still around. Then everything changed. In the late 1800s, The Industrial Revolution completely reshaped the country. America was no longer just a nation of farms and small towns. Factories were opening everywhere. Railroads connected cities that had once been days apart. New jobs promised steady wages, and for millions of young people, that opportunity was impossible to ignore. So they left. They packed their bags and headed to places like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and New York. For the first time, large numbers of Americans left the places where they had grown up and built entirely new lives hundreds of miles away. It wasn't because they didn't love their families. They were chasing something their parents never had: a paycheck, a career, and the chance to build a better future. But every opportunity came with a price. The family support system that had existed for centuries slowly started falling apart. Parents stayed behind. Their children built lives somewhere else. And when those parents eventually became too old to work, many discovered there was no one nearby to help them anymore. This wasn't just happening to a few families. It was happening across the country. America was becoming richer, more modern, and more industrial. Yet at the same time, growing old was becoming more uncertain than ever. For the first time, thousands of elderly Americans found themselves facing a frightening question: who will take care of me now? The government didn't have an answer. Employers didn't have one either. There were no retirement accounts, no guaranteed pensions for most workers, no Social Security waiting in the background. If your children lived hundreds of miles away, or if they were struggling to support their own families, you often had nowhere to turn. A problem that had once been handled inside the home was becoming a national problem, and the country wasn't prepared for it. As factories continued to grow and cities expanded, so did the number of older Americans living without family support or financial security. For many of them, there was only one place left. It was a place that every American feared, a place people prayed they would never have to enter: the poorhouse. For many older Americans back then, there was one place they hoped they would never end up: the poorhouse. Just hearing that word was enough to make people uneasy. It wasn't simply another place to live. It represented failure, dependence, and the fear of growing old with nowhere else to go. Poorhouses, sometimes called almshouses, had been around since colonial America. Local governments created them as a last resort for people who couldn't support themselves. But they weren't built just for the elderly. Under one roof, you could find older adults, widows, orphans, people with disabilities, the mentally ill, and anyone else who had nowhere to turn. Everyone was placed together, no matter their age or situation. Life inside wasn't meant to be comfortable. Residents often slept in crowded rooms with little privacy. Food was basic. Medical care was limited. Many buildings were cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and badly overcrowded. People weren't expected to rebuild their lives there. They were simply expected to survive. For many elderly residents, that became the final chapter of their lives. As the years passed, something surprising happened. Children were gradually moved to orphanages. People with mental illness were sent to specialized institutions. Those convicted of crimes went to prisons. But one group stayed: older Americans. Little by little, the poorhouse became America's first version of a retirement home, but without the comfort, dignity, or security we associate with that idea today. Imagine spending decades working, raising a family, paying your way through life, only to end up sharing a crowded room with strangers because your body could no longer earn a paycheck. That wasn't just heartbreaking, it terrified people. The fear of ending up in a poorhouse became deeply rooted in American culture. Parents worried about it, workers worried about it, families talked about it. It wasn't simply about being poor. It was about losing your independence and becoming someone else's responsibility. Many people believed that if you ended up there, you had somehow failed, but the truth was far more complicated. Most working-class families weren't lazy or irresponsible. They simply didn't earn enough to prepare for years of old age. A serious illness, an injury, or losing family support could erase a lifetime of hard work. The system blamed individuals for problems they often couldn't control. As more Americans watched parents, neighbors, and friends spend their final years inside these institutions, one thing became painfully clear. The country couldn't keep relying on poorhouses forever. America needed a better answer. The question was, who would be willing to build it? America couldn't keep sending older people to poorhouses forever. Eventually, some communities realized something had to change. The first real safety nets didn't come from the federal government or big corporations. They came from ordinary people helping one another. Across the country, churches, religious charities, and fraternal organizations began creating homes for their aging members. Groups like the Masons, the Oddfellows, Irish benevolent societies, German mutual aid organizations, and Jewish charitable groups all stepped in where the system had failed. The idea was simple. While members were young and working, they paid small monthly dues. Years later, if they became too old to support themselves, the organization would provide housing, meals, and basic care. It wasn't luxury living. But compared to a poorhouse, it was a completely different world. People were treated with more dignity. They lived alongside others from the same community, shared similar values, and often had people who genuinely cared about their well-being. Religious groups played an important role too. Homes run by churches welcomed elderly people who had nowhere else to go. One well-known example was the Little Sisters of the Poor, whose home in Washington, D.C. opened in 1873 and accepted residents regardless of race or religion. At a time when those barriers were common, that was a remarkable commitment. Still, these programs had one major limitation. They only helped the people connected to those organizations. If you weren't a member of a church, a fraternal society, or a local charity, you were usually out of luck. Millions of working Americans still had no real retirement plan. Then, in 1875, something happened that quietly changed the conversation. American Express introduced the first private corporate pension plan in the United States. Back then, American Express wasn't the credit card company we know today. It was mainly involved in freight and transportation. But its new pension program introduced an idea that was almost revolutionary. Maybe employers had some responsibility to support workers after decades of loyal service. The plan wasn't available to everyone. Employees had to meet strict requirements. They needed years of service, had to reach retirement age, and still needed approval from company leadership before receiving benefits. Even then, the payments were modest. But the amount wasn't what mattered most. The idea itself was. For the first time, a major American company publicly recognized that retirement wasn't just a personal problem. It was something employers might also have a role in solving. Other large companies slowly followed. It wasn't a complete solution, not even close. But after generations of relying on family, charity, or the poorhouse, America had finally taken its first real step toward building a modern retirement system. No one knew it yet, but an even bigger transformation was still ahead. Just as America was beginning to build a better retirement system, everything fell apart. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. Most people remember that moment as the beginning of the Great Depression. But for millions of ordinary Americans, the real disaster wasn't what happened on Wall Street. It was what happened afterward. Banks started failing across the country. Businesses shut down. Jobs disappeared. Families who had spent years saving for the future watched their life savings vanish almost overnight. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 American banks closed their doors. If your money was in one of those banks, there was a good chance it was simply gone. No federal insurance, no safety net, nothing. Older Americans were hit harder than almost anyone else. Many had already stopped working, or were too old to start over. Others lost their jobs and quickly realized no one wanted to hire an aging worker during the worst economic crisis the country had ever seen. By 1934, nearly half of all older Americans could no longer support themselves financially. Everything they had counted on was gone. Their savings disappeared. Their pensions often weren't enough or didn't exist at all. And their children were struggling just to survive themselves. For many families, the poorhouse once again became a painful reality. The crisis forced Americans to face an uncomfortable truth. Working hard your entire life didn't guarantee security in old age. Sometimes forces completely outside your control could erase decades of sacrifice in just a few years. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that charity and family support were no longer enough. America had grown into a modern industrial nation, but it was still relying on an outdated system to protect its oldest citizens. Something bigger had to change. On the 14th of August, 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. For the first time in American history, the federal government promised workers that after years of paying into the system, they would receive a monthly income in retirement. It wasn't a large payment. It was never meant to replace a full paycheck. But it gave millions of people something they had never had before. A basic level of security. More importantly, it gave them hope. The fear of growing old without any support no longer felt completely unavoidable. Over the years, Social Security expanded, more workers became eligible, benefits gradually improved. Programs like disability insurance and Medicare would eventually strengthen the safety net even further. For millions of Americans, Social Security became one of the most important programs ever created. But even Roosevelt knew it wasn't supposed to do everything by itself. It was only one piece of a much larger retirement system. And for a while, that system actually seemed to work. For a while, it looked like America had finally figured retirement out. After World War II, the country entered one of the strongest economic booms in its history. Factories were busy, businesses were expanding. Millions of veterans returned home, started families, bought houses, and found steady jobs. Wages kept rising, and companies were competing to attract good workers. One of the best ways to do that was with a pension. Instead of telling employees to save for retirement on their own, many companies made a promise. Stay with us. Work hard. Give us the best years of your life. And when you're ready to retire, we'll keep sending you a paycheck every month. For millions of Americans, that promise felt solid. It gave workers something they had never really had before, a future they could actually picture. If you worked for companies like General Motors, Ford, US, Steel, AT&T, or other major employers, retirement no longer felt uncertain. It became something you could plan for. By 1970, nearly half of all private sector workers were covered by some type of pension plan. For many families, this became the American dream. You spent 30 or 40 years with one company. You retired with a steady monthly income. Social Security helped cover basic expenses, while your pension gave you enough to enjoy life after work. This was the era people still remember today. The retirement party, the gold watch, the handshake from your boss, more time with your grandchildren, fishing trips, travel, working in the garden instead of working on a factory floor. For one generation, retirement finally looked like the reward people had always hoped for. It wasn't perfect, but compared to everything that came before, from poorhouses to financial uncertainty, it felt like incredible progress. The system seemed balanced. Workers did their part, companies honored their promises, the government provided Social Security. Together, those pieces created a retirement system that many believed would last forever. But underneath the surface, there was a problem almost nobody could see. Many pension plans weren't backed by enough money to keep those promises. On paper, everything looked secure. In reality, some companies were promising benefits they couldn't actually afford to pay. Employees had no easy way to know that. They trusted the companies they had spent decades working for. And why wouldn't they? No one expected that a lifetime of loyalty could disappear because of decisions made in a corporate boardroom. But that's exactly what was about to happen. One company would expose a weakness hiding inside America's retirement system, and after that, everything began to change. The retirement system looked strong from the outside. Workers trusted it, companies stood behind it, and most people believed that if they stayed loyal to one employer, that promise would be there when they finally retired. Then one company shattered that belief. Its name was Studebaker. For decades, Studebaker had been one of America's most respected manufacturers. The company started in the 1850s building wagons, before becoming a well-known automaker. It survived the Civil War, the rise of the automobile, and years of competition in one of the toughest industries in the country. To the people working there, it felt like a stable place to build a career. Many employees spent 20 or even 30 years on the factory floor. They weren't just building cars, they were building what they believed would be a secure retirement. But behind the scenes, the company's finances were falling apart. Sales kept dropping. Costs kept rising. And there was one problem almost no worker knew about. Studebaker hadn't put enough money into its pension fund. The company had made big promises, but it hadn't fully funded them. For years, nobody noticed. Everything looked fine until it wasn't. In December 1963, Studebaker shut down its South Bend, Indiana production plant. Not long after, its pension plan collapsed. The impact was devastating. Some retirees who had already begun receiving benefits were protected because their payments had already been secured, but thousands of workers weren't so lucky. Around 4,000 employees who had spent decades with the company received only a fraction of what they had been promised. On average, they got about 15 cents for every dollar they had expected. Think about that for a moment. Imagine working for the same company for over 20 years. You show up every day, you trust the promise you've been given. Then, just as retirement is finally within reach, you find out most of it is gone. Even worse, nearly 3,000 employees with fewer years of service received nothing at all. Years of loyalty disappeared almost overnight. The Studebaker collapse shocked the entire country. People suddenly realized something they had never seriously considered before. A pension wasn't guaranteed simply because a company promised one. If the company failed, if the pension fund didn't have enough money, workers could lose everything they had spent a lifetime earning. That discovery changed how Americans viewed retirement forever. The trust that had defined the post-war pension system was badly shaken, and the pressure on Washington grew stronger every year. Workers wanted one simple thing. If companies were going to promise retirement benefits, someone had to make sure those promises were actually kept. The Studebaker collapse was impossible to ignore. Workers across the country started asking the same question. If a company can promise a pension for decades, then walk away when the money runs out, what is that promise really worth? Congress couldn't keep avoiding the issue. For years, lawmakers debated how to protect workers without putting too much pressure on businesses. Progress was slow, different groups fought over what the rules should look like, and nothing changed overnight. But the public kept paying attention. The Studebaker story had exposed a problem that wasn't unique to one company. It could happen anywhere. Finally, in 1974, President Gerald Ford signed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, better known as ERISA. It became one of the most important retirement laws in American history. For the first time, companies couldn't simply make pension promises without following strict rules. ERISA required employers to fund their pension plans more responsibly. It also created the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, or PBGC, a government agency designed to help protect workers if a company's pension plan failed. In other words, if a business went bankrupt and couldn't pay the retirement benefits it had promised, there was finally a safety net. Workers also gained stronger legal rights. Companies had to be more transparent about how pension plans worked. Employees could better understand what they had earned and what they were entitled to receive. After everything that had happened, those protections were badly needed. It felt like the government had finally stepped in to restore trust. But every solution comes with a cost. Following ERISA wasn't cheap. Companies now had to contribute more money to their pension funds. They faced stricter reporting requirements, more paperwork, and greater legal responsibility if something went wrong. For many employers, especially smaller businesses, pensions suddenly became much more expensive to maintain. Even large corporations started asking themselves an uncomfortable question. Was there a less expensive way to help employees save for retirement? The question quietly changed the future. No one passed a law saying pensions should disappear. No one announced that companies should stop offering them. Instead, businesses simply began looking for another option, one that shifted more responsibility away from employers and onto workers. At the time, almost nobody realized what was coming next. The next chapter wouldn't begin with a famous speech, a national debate, or a major political movement. It would begin with a small section of the tax code that most people had never even heard of. And that tiny piece of legislation would completely reshape the way millions of Americans prepared for retirement. By the late 1970s, most people thought the biggest retirement debates were already behind them. They were wrong. The biggest change was about to begin, and almost nobody noticed it happening. In 1978, Congress passed the Revenue Act, a massive tax bill packed with hundreds of different provisions. Buried deep inside it was a short section of the tax code called Section 401, subsection K. It was only about a page and a half long. It wasn't front-page news. There wasn't a heated debate about it. Most lawmakers didn't think it would change much of anything. For nearly 2 years, it didn't. Then a benefits consultant named Ted Benna happened to read it. Benna wasn't trying to reinvent retirement. He was simply looking for a better way to help one of his clients create a tax-efficient savings plan. As he read through the new law, something caught his attention. He realized the language could be interpreted much more broadly than anyone seemed to expect. Instead of applying only to certain executive compensation plans, what if regular employees could also set aside part of their paycheck before taxes? And what if employers encouraged people to save by matching part of those contributions? It was a bold idea. Even Benna later admitted it was an aggressive interpretation of the law. The tax code didn't clearly say employees could do this. But it didn't clearly say they couldn't either. That small gap changed everything. Benna first presented the idea to one of his clients, but they turned it down. They worried the IRS might reject the whole concept. So instead of giving up, he introduced the plan at his own company. That became the first true 401k plan in the United States. Soon after, Benna worked with government officials as new regulations were developed. Then, in 1981, the IRS officially approved rules allowing 401k plans to operate the way Benna had envisioned. Almost overnight, companies started paying attention. Major employers saw a new opportunity. Workers could save for retirement directly from their paychecks before taxes. Employers could offer matching contributions. And compared with traditional pensions, the long-term financial commitment was much smaller. The financial industry noticed too. Mutual fund companies, investment firms, insurance providers, and brokerages all recognized that millions of Americans would now be investing for retirement through these new accounts. The 401k spread faster than almost anyone expected. At first, it was promoted as something extra, a way to supplement pensions and Social Security. Few people imagined it would someday become the foundation of retirement for millions of Americans. But that's exactly where the country was headed. Without realizing it, America had just taken the first step toward replacing a system built on guaranteed pensions with one that placed far more responsibility on individual workers. Once the 401k became widely available, the retirement system started changing faster than almost anyone expected. At first, pensions and 401k existed side by side. That was the original idea. Social Security would provide a basic foundation. Company pensions would guarantee a steady monthly income, and a 401k would simply help people save a little more for retirement. It sounded like the perfect combination, but that's not what happened. Companies quickly realized the 401 KEK was much less expensive than maintaining a traditional pension. With a pension, employers carried almost all the responsibility. They had to make sure there was enough money to pay retirees for the rest of their lives, no matter what happened in the economy. If the stock market dropped, if investments performed poorly, or if retirees lived longer than expected, the company still had to pay. A 401 KALA worked very differently. The employer made its contribution, often by matching part of the employee's savings, and after that, the responsibility shifted. The investment choices belonged to the worker. The market risk belonged to the worker. Even the possibility of running out of money in retirement belonged to the worker. For businesses, it was a much simpler system. For employees, it was a completely different kind of promise. The change happened gradually. There wasn't one law that ended pensions. There wasn't one announcement saying companies had to switch. One employer after another simply stopped offering traditional pension plans to new workers and replaced them with 401ks instead. Before long, what had started as a supplement became the main retirement plan for millions of Americans. Even Ted Benna, the man who helped bring the 401k to life, later admitted this wasn't how he imagined it would be used. He believed it should support pensions, not replace them. He also became increasingly concerned about the growing fees charged by the financial industry and the fact that ordinary workers were now expected to make complicated investment decisions on their own. For many people, retirement had quietly become a personal responsibility in ways it had never been before. Today, millions of Americans still rely on their 401k accounts. Some have built significant savings. Others have struggled to contribute at all. Many are still wondering if what they've saved will actually be enough. Looking back, the story of retirement in America isn't really about one investment account or one government program. It's about who carries the risk of growing old. For a time, families carried that burden. Then employers and the government shared more of it through pensions and Social Security. Today, much of that responsibility has shifted back to individuals. The poorhouse may be gone, but the fear that once sent people there hasn't completely disappeared. It has simply taken a different form. Instead of worrying about a place to live, many Americans now stare at a retirement account balance, hoping it will somehow be enough. And maybe that's the biggest lesson in this entire story. The 401k didn't just change how Americans save for retirement, it changed who is expected to carry the weight of retirement itself. When you step back and look at this whole story, one thing becomes clear. America's retirement system wasn't built all at once. It evolved one crisis at a time. When families could no longer carry the burden alone, communities stepped in. When charities weren't enough, companies created pensions. When pensions failed too many workers, the government introduced Social Security. And when pensions became too expensive for many employers, the 401k rose to take their place. Each change solved a real problem. But each one also created a new challenge that the next generation had to deal with. That's what makes this story so fascinating. Retirement has never really been just about money. It's about security. It's about independence. It's about knowing that after decades of hard work, you'll still have the freedom to live with dignity. For a brief period in American history, that responsibility was shared between families, employers, and the government. Today, much of that responsibility rests on individuals. That's why so many people still worry about retirement, even after years of working, saving, and doing everything they were told to do. History reminds us that no retirement system is permanent. The one we depend on today wasn't carefully planned from the very beginning. It changed because the country changed. And just as it changed before, it will almost certainly change again. The real lesson isn't simply to understand how the 401 KEK works. It's to understand how quickly the rules can change and why knowing the history behind those changes matters. Because once you understand where today's system came from, you start asking better questions about where it's headed next. And that may be the most valuable investment any of us can make. If this story gave you a new perspective on retirement, money, or the hidden history behind America's financial system, we'd love to have you join us. Subscribe to Forgotten Code, where we go beyond the headlines and uncover the stories that shape the world we live in today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.